Hello.
Hey Fred, how are you? Good to see you.
Buongiorno mio amico Franco.
Riccardo, come stai?
Bene, molto bene.
Bravo, bravo. That was rich, right?
Yeah, it was for sure. I hope it's okay if I sit in today.
Riccardo, are you kidding me?
Always time for you, my friend.
It's great to see your name there, but I don't see your lovely face.
I was trying to spare the world the pain and sorrow.
Rich, your shirt matches my blanket in the background.
I noticed that, yeah. Forever Griffins, forever Griffins.
Right on, man.
Yeah. Excuse me, Lalit, sorry.
It's wonderful to see you, to see your beautiful face, as Franco says.
And wonderful to hear Italian.
Ah.
Love it.
Well, only Franco speaks properly. I'm broken Italian. I'm only half.
Yeah.
All I need to know, all I can say in Italian is "che cosa dici?"
That's one that you probably say frequently these days, you know.
Absolutely. What do you say? Of course, I'm Irish. Our flag is very similar. Our flag is very similar. I think we stole it from you and just painted one side of it yellow instead of red.
Which is that, the
Irish flag?
Oh, the Irish flag. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Actually, you know, it was copied from the Newfoundland flag, the original Newfoundland flag, which was actually 2 shades of blue and white in the middle. And people say, you know, you've got the tricolor in Ireland, it means peace between the North and the South. Actually, it means nothing when it was put together. It's just a flag. But we can tell a story, just like the Italians could. The Irish and the Italians were very similar.
Oh, yeah.
La famiglia.
Good storyteller.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. In the Yoga Speaker Series, all the languages are welcome, okay? So speak your language, whatever you can, okay? So
I'll say in Gaelic, Dias Mirgat agus Conastatu.
There you go.
I'll make a Hanawap because Lydia. And Sheila O'Reilly, you should know that.
You know what? I don't.
Well,
which is awful, but I love it. I should.
So I'll say in Sanskrit, Dhanyavad. Dhanyavad. So that means welcome. Welcome to the Yoga Speaker Series 2021. And we are very happy, you know, we are always very happy to see all of you, or any one of you, remember that we are one family here. And we have been doing this, not speaker series, but, you know, a little bit of yoga from 2009 when Professor Dwivedi, O.P. Dwivedi, he started this initiative, and then later in 2010, I took over from there. And since then, you know, we have been growing. We have been growing with all of you, okay? All of you, staff, faculty, students, you know, alumni, you know, retirees, all of them. And even beyond, you know, even beyond the city and, you know, throughout, you know, where we can reach. So anyways, we will start this series, this event today. So my name is Lalit Jerath. If you have been attending these events, you may know by now, okay, or maybe we may have heard from somebody. And I'm an employee at the University of Guelph for almost 25 years now, you know. So you know where to work. If you are in Guelph, now you can work remotely too, okay? So you work at the University of Guelph, okay? It has been a wonderful journey. And you know that I have been teaching, you know, as I say, yoga for over 10 years. So what we will do is before we start our event today, we will do a little bit of meditation, or sometimes we call conditioning. Okay, so let's do that. So join your palms together. Okay, so as you know, if you have been to my class, as soon as you join the palms together, the yoga starts happening, because the opposite polarities, so the union starts happening. So what you can do is, I had in the posting that bring your yoga mat, okay, and there was a reason for that, because I want you to experience what's the difference between sitting in the chair and sitting on the mat or on the floor, okay, or in the chair if you can sit, because the things starts happening differently, okay. Your concentration, your focus will be different, very different. Okay, it takes a little bit time. I'm saying that because yoga is very symbolic. It's very, very symbolic. And what happens when you cross your legs and sit down? You cannot go anywhere. Okay, so when you cannot go anywhere, okay, then your mind starts coming down. Okay, so every yoga pose, okay, has some symbol behind it. So what we are going to do is we are going to start by, okay, so rub your palms, warm them a little bit, and then make a cup of your palms and cover your eyes. So we call it conditioning. We call it conditioning because we are trying to bring the evenness in our mind, in our emotions, in our feelings. We are preparing for something. We are trying to focus on something beautiful that's going to happen today. We have one of the very, very wonderful speaker with us today. So what we can do is we can start focusing on our breath. While we are doing it, make sure that your spine is straight, okay? So I forgot that instruction, that's okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to expand your spine, okay? Expand your spine, how? By expanding the sternum, okay? So expanding the sternum. This is very, very good, very, very important, okay? And then your spine will be straight. So expand your sternum. That will straighten your spine. So we are bringing our mind from out somewhere to inside. And feel the breath. Breath, that is the life force. We don't pay much attention, but it is the most important thing for our life, the life force. And I find that this is one of the easiest way that you can feel your breath at your nostrils. So keep your eyes closed, and I just want to do one more thing, and then we'll start our speaker series, okay? So use your index finger, keep your eyes closed, use your index finger, and then close the flaps of your ears and hear what is inside. So beautiful there. Okay, you can bring your arms down, you can put on your knees or beside you. So I just wanted to give you a little glimpse, that could be your stethoscope, when you just, close your ear flaps. So what I'm going to do is that I just wanted to share that this initiative is supported by the University of Guelph's, Wellness at Work. And this series is hosted by University of Guelph's Yoga and Meditation Initiative. As I say, we have been doing this for 10 years, but very recently, we have come up with this platform where anybody can come and join, okay, no matter what. So what you will find is that on the chart, we will have some links, website links and feedback links. So maybe you can look at that, and then please do share the feedback. This meeting is recorded. So if your video is on and you're speaking, you will be on the screen and that will be recorded. So the theme of this yoga speaker series is yoga philosophy and practice, relevance for the individual and society in a contemporary world. So this is our third event. We have talked about lots of different things about how we can yoke the individual with the society. We talked in the first event and the second event. We have 5 speakers. And then now I will introduce Dr. Franco. So Dr. Franco, everybody knows that, he's the professor of psychology at the University of Guelph. He's the past president and the vice chancellor, I forgot the dates here, but he retired in 2020 August, So Franco, I'll leave it to you now. The stage is yours. It's your show now. And Franco is first going to do land acknowledgement, and then he's going to talk about pleasure, anxiety, and balance. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lalit, for that introduction. Let me begin with the land acknowledgement, which, of course, is a reminder for all of us as where we come from, where we work, and the University of Guelph. The University of Guelph resides in the ancestral and treaty lands of the Attawandaran people and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we recognize and honor our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors. The dish with one spoon covenant speaks to our collective responsibility to steward and sustain the land and environment in which we live and work. So thank you for the opportunity to do that acknowledgement. And thank you again, Lalit, for that wonderful introduction and setting the context a little bit. Let me first of all say how much I appreciate this opportunity, and in particular because it's an opportunity to connect with all of you. My University of Guelph community, and for me, this community, you all have been such a huge part of my own journey, my own life, and as I mentioned, actually in some of my remarks at the end of my term as president, that having served as the president and vice chancellor is truly the greatest honor of my professional life, and so it's a huge part of who I am. So thank you for this opportunity to connect with the group. And I have to say, I've given a few presentations this year to different academic groups, but I have to say this, of course, feels extra special connecting with all of you today for those reasons. So thank you again. This last year has certainly been a ride. It's been a wild ride and a real transition that we're all going to remember, I'm sure. I know that for me, it's been a year during which time kind of feels like it has both slowed down and sped up in the same breath. It's actually a melange of slowing down and speeding up. It's been a time of renewal, a time of change. I would also say, importantly, a time of reflection as we work through this pandemic. I know that's been the case for me, and I'm sure it's been the case for many of us. And all this to say that I think that the timing was interesting when Daniel Atlin, who's your VP External and a wonderful colleague and friend, and Lalit, reached out to me about this lecture series. I thought, wow, what an interesting coincidence, in terms of reflection, this period that we're in. And I really appreciated the invite. So this is a great time, I think, to share some thoughts around mindfulness and balance. And I want to thank you again for taking the time and sharing your time today. As I reflected on this talk and what I would talk about, I found myself organizing different facets of my life and experiences. So what you're going to get today from me is not a pure psychology or neuroscience talk, but it's really a bit of a collection, I guess, of perspectives, of views that have come out of my various life experiences, personal, social, professional, and kind of put together in to capture the energy, I would say, from those various experiences. I have a few ideas that I do want to share with you in the next 30 minutes. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll just highlight a couple of the key points that I'll be going over. One is thoughts and perspectives around the importance of clarity, clarity and what clarity means for us. A second point, the importance of creating space, and actually what space means, and the recognition that this is not actually easy. Seems easy enough, but it's actually not easy. Also, share some thoughts on how pleasure and well-being, as well as anxiety and fear, fit into all of this. And some of this will involve talking a little bit about the brain and equilibrium, concept of equilibrium. And I think that neuroscience actually, interestingly enough, teaches us some fascinating things about equilibrium and just the way we're designed. So I thought there's some such interesting parallels in terms of how the body, the brain in particular, is organized with respect to equilibrium, and how we search and quest for equilibrium and balance in our lives. So those parallels I think are interesting, and I'll bring a little bit more of a psychology and neuroscience lens to those. Now, as I was thinking about this yoga lecture, my mind, and when I first received the invitation, my mind immediately went to a memory from 10 years ago, around 10 years ago, when I was still at the University of Toronto, and I hosted a visit from the Dalai Lama. And I'll tell you a very quick story about that. At the time, in addition to being a professor of psychology and neuroscience at U of T, I was also the vice president and head of the University of Toronto Scarborough. I was the principal there. And we were in the process of organizing a symposium on brain and mindfulness. We had some outstanding academics at UTSC, University of Toronto Scarborough, as well at the St. George campus. We thought it was a real opportunity to bring them together and talk about the relationship between brain and mindfulness. And at around that time, as we were organizing this, I heard that the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, was actually visiting Toronto at approximately in that period. So I thought, well, why don't we invite the Dalai Lama? I thought, what better invitee to complement our scientists than the Dalai Lama? Some of my team said, well, how are you going to get the Dalai Lama here? I said, well, I don't know. I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to call him and invite him to come, and hopefully he'll accept. They thought some people thought it was going to be complicated, but it actually was pretty simple. It's all about just communicating and reaching out. So I invited His Holiness to visit the University of Toronto during this time that he was planning to come to Toronto to participate in our symposium, and hoping that he'd of course be our guest of honor. Well, not only did the Dalai Lama accept our invitation, but he was actually absolutely delighted to participate. In other words, he didn't want to just be in the audience. He actually wanted to be a part of the symposium and wanted to be a part of that scientific conversation. Now, we were all delighted that he accepted the invitation, but all of us, and me as well were particularly intrigued and curious as to why he was so interested in participating. Well, I have to tell you that when the day arrived, the answer to that question, why was he interested in participating rather than just being more ceremonial, if you will, a more ceremonial role, became very clear. He was genuinely and absolutely super interested and fascinated by brain function and neuroscience. And he wanted to be a part of the symposium. He wanted to ask questions. He wanted to hear what people had to say. And it was just, it was a very, very special kind of moment just to see that kind of energy. It was almost like a youthful and innocent sense of curiosity and exploration that he had. Actually, you know what? As I'm talking, I'm just going to reach over here. Since we're talking, I didn't think of this, but there's a photograph of the gift exchange at the end. So it was a highlight, something I'll remember. But in particular, the reason I'm going to remember it is because of his incredible spirit of exploration and discovery. And it was something that I guess I should have expected, but to see it expressed in that context was quite something. Which is a good segue, I think, into some thoughts I'd like to share around the concept of clarity. You know, as I think about yoga and meditation, a word that jumps out for me is the word clarity. And when we think about clarity, I tend to also think about complexity and the relationship between the two. And you know, in the context of yoga, so much of yoga is about managing and stopping, I guess what you would call the complex mind, and seeing the simplicity and clarity of what is inside all of us. So there's an interesting kind of push-pull between, you know, clarity and complexity, simplicity and complexity in our efforts to create clarity. The energy, I think about the mind and the brain, the energy required to have clarity for simple questions is less energy than is required to achieve clarity on what are ostensibly more complex questions. So that an apple is the color red requires relatively little energy. It's a fairly low bar. The bar is low because the question is simple and our semantic memory systems understand what red is. There is a fast and strong clarity. But of course, if you ask why, you just add one little question before that, it said why the apple is red or what red means, the answer becomes more complex. There are maturation processes to consider, genetic considerations, epigenetic considerations. There's also subjective questions around perception of what red actually means and how do different species or life forms experience the color red. At the end of the day, this too can be made much more simple, but only after a process, only after we devote and commit energy into that process of deeper understanding. And part of what people have written about when we talk about slow thinking, our fast thinking systems and our slow thinking systems. And I think we live in a time where our fast thinking systems are getting a lot of practice. We have probably a generation that have the most well-evolved fast thinking systems ever in the history of humanity because of information flow. And the other side of that coin, though, is the slow thinking system and that balance between fast thinking and slow thinking. And sometimes I do feel that we are oscillating a little bit of a bias towards the fast thinking system, and perhaps in some cases losing or not exercising enough our slow thinking system. So this is a reminder of the importance of that. So to achieve clarity, taking information and creating deeper knowledge from that information is key. It's not about information per se, in my view. It's really about creating new knowledge. and I tend to think of new knowledge as an emerging property of information. When information is brought together, thoughtfully integrated, you add the energy of the mind to that information and reflect on it deeply, an emerging property happens. There's an emerging thing called knowledge, a new level of understanding. It's a process that considers not only the core information, the ingredients of the information being given to us, but also the context, how that, where it comes from, why it's being given, etc. That's also part of, excuse me, of the information that we're being given, and to put all that together. I would say that today we have plenty of information, more than humans, I would suggest, have ever had access to. And in addition to that, moreover, the democratization of information, the fact that it's available to so many so broadly, has made information available to historically unprecedented numbers of people in parts of the world. So with all this, we have plenty of information. While we have all that, achieving new knowledge from putting all this information together thoughtfully and carefully is the challenge. You know, having spent a big part of my life working to understand the workings of the brain, the mind, and behavior, I think a lot about the difference between information and knowledge. And there are so many levels of analysis and so many levels of understanding to work through. And working through each of these levels of analysis increases the level of true clarity. Sometimes, I was thinking of a metaphor or analogy for this. Sometimes it's like a microscope. It's like changing the magnification level of a microscope. You see the insides of a cell at a certain level of magnification, and then when you increase the level of magnification, you have a completely different picture. In fact, it's almost unrecognizable compared to the other, even though you're looking at fundamentally the same cell. So it's different levels of analysis, and the microscope's one metaphor. But sometimes you need to look at the inside of the brain close up in high magnification, but other times in low magnification or from afar. And there you have more of a telescope, analogy. So it's not just about, really understanding deeply the component parts and the nuances. It's also stepping back and seeing it from afar. With all of these experiences, setting your sights at different levels, there's a new and different clarity that comes out of things. And truly, when I think about my experience as president, and during those amazing years, truly amazing years, that sense of clarity is something that I very often had in mind. How clear is this? And have I, do I have the broadest sense of this? And a lot of that has to do with the space within which that clarity has happened. Have I, am I confident that I've broadened the space? By the way, you see me using my hands. That's my Italian background, Southern Italian background. Very difficult to not use my hands. If I don't use my hands, I probably will stop talking. So I'll have to use them. So you broaden the parameters. The more you broaden the parameters, the more space you have. So the actual mental space, and I spend a little bit of time talking about that as well, becomes important. So, clarity, different levels of analysis, not being afraid to explore those different levels, and to quite frankly also not be judgmental about. You may have certain preconceived ideas about those different levels of analysis, but that shouldn't stop us from nonetheless inviting those perspectives in and experiencing them and understanding them, and trying to create bridges between our own sense of perspective, our own perspectives, and those other perspectives. With respect to openness and space, this, of course, is very important. Introducing a new piece of information into your knowledge base requires space if it's going to be received. And I would say it also requires understanding the clutter, the mental clutter, so that you can welcome the new information, but also make sense of the new information when you introduce it. You know, it's a little bit like welcoming someone into your home. I mean, you need space. If the place is packed and there's all sorts of people there and milling around, or there's furniture, and it's very difficult to invite people in. And so you need space, but you also need the space to be organized in a particular way so that there is room to navigate within that space. Of course, when I talk about space and complexity and navigation, I can't help but think about, you know, my time as president. And there actually, when I talked about the privilege of having served as president, I think a big part of that privilege for me is having the privilege actually to experience, to have the context to experience the different perspectives, to be exposed to so much information, to actually open up a broader world. And there were, of course, many challenges and many issues that certainly required clarity. And I will tell you, there was a lot of information. So when we, you know, were faced with a particular challenge or issue, there was certainly no lack of information. There was plenty of information. And I was so incredibly fortunate during my time because I had an amazing team. And we worked together to create that clarity and deepen our understanding. And for that, we needed space. We needed space as individuals for our own, you know, needs and within the context of our own lives. But we also needed space as a team. We needed to create space as a team. And I was quite adamant about the team part of it. You know, it was very important to me that we bring minds together, the different perspectives together, and the different spaces together to create a team space. And I think you get a better product. You have a better outcome when you do that. I guess the other thing I would say about those experiences and the inviting of information and perspectives into our space is to think about the kind of energy that those entries give to you. So you know, my experiences is that it's pretty clear when you're developing a perspective or you're having new information that gives you positive energy, that gives you strength, gives you an exploratory, strong, forward-moving energy, versus information and perspectives that were actually energy sapping, that would bring that were negative, that in many ways were negative energy sources. And what I would say to that is that for me, it was never so much a question of blocking out or minimizing the things I didn't like or didn't feel good, or the things we didn't like and didn't feel good. It was a matter of actually bringing them in and understanding them more deeply. How can, for example, one of the questions I would often ask myself when I was interacting with someone or a group that had a view that was, at least on the surface, completely 180 degrees opposite of my view. I would always start from a very simple, a simple concept. I started from a position of enormous respect for that person. I said, well, if this person has reached, you know, their great place where they are in their lives, and I have great respect, how can I make sense of the fact that they have an opinion that's opposite mine? And I would work to create that bridge, but it was really anchored in a sense of respect for other human beings and their own stories and their own and their own journeys. So it was certainly a great context and place to develop those kind of that kind of approach, I guess, to problem solving. The other thing I would, that's what I was just reminded of this. You know, the other thing I would often talk about is news. We would be receiving news nonstop. Just it was a river of news, like constant information, new news. And people sometimes would come into my office. They would say, "Oh, I've got some bad news," or "I've got some good news." And I would often, somewhat jokingly, say, we don't need the words good or bad. There's just news. We decide if it's good or bad. We make it good or bad. But I really didn't see much value in labeling news good or bad news. It was just information. It was up to us as a team to put that information together and to create goodness, you know, out of it for ourselves. And so that qualitative judgment of whether news is good or bad, I always struggled with, because it's just a piece of paper, or it's information someone's you know, providing for us. Whether it's good or bad is really up to us, you know, what we do with it. And it is very much, I guess, aligned with my view of value-based approaches to kind of decision making and working through these processes. And I'm happy to talk about that more during the question period. So this is the creating space is perhaps the biggest challenge in our lives, and as we seek clarity on complex issue, is finding that space to allow for that process. But it's not just about finding time. It's also about finding and acknowledging that the imbalances that exist. It's about finding the sweet spot that acknowledges the different forces at play. And when you do that, it also allows us as individuals to find the tools to help us stay anchored and balanced. So if you're not confronted with imbalance or forces that try to knock you off balance, then you can't engage the tools that you have inside you to create that balance. So that when we act, the other piece to this is that, you know, when it comes time for action and time, we can then, if we've done all this, if we've given space and we've done this reflection, we can then act from a position of preparedness and stability. We have a high bar. We have waded in those deeper waters of understanding. And this isn't only true, of course, for leadership roles and, you know, presidents and that kind of thing. It's true in all of our lives. It's true in our lives in general. It's not easy to stay anchored when the ongoing river of information distractions flows so quickly and throw one off. It's a process, and it goes on, and we integrate new information and new discoveries into our perspectives. And I do think that it's also practice. It's practice. I mean, I think about, for example, I remember when my kids were young, we used to go to this river, Beaver River, up in Grey County, and they loved going into the river, the creek, to collect golf balls, because it was on a golf course. And we would go after hours when the golf course was closed, and I remember being afraid, actually, because at one point my kids, they were quite young and they were very petite, both of them, and the river actually had a pretty heavy current, and she was trying. One of my daughters was trying to create stability, and she was successful in it, but it was on the edge. And it was a very strong image, and I think in some ways it's a good image, because as we did that week after week, she got better and better at it. The current was the same, but she was more and more stable. So we can learn how to handle and how to create more stability and strength as we deal with this information, this rapid flow of information. And so all of this is a journey towards an evolving sense of clarity. And I would also say that with that clarity, you can help your own preparedness. that when action, as I mentioned, is needed, your response will be more disciplined and deeper. And you know, I know, again, I remember many situations where, you know, people would ask, well, that was a tough decision. How did you, but you know, if I was fortunate enough to have had the time to reflect on it, I always felt very comfortable and confident with those decisions, because they felt disciplined, and they felt that they were anchored in deeper thoughts, even though they had to be done quickly and at the moment. But that process had preceded that, and I had the opportunity to dive more deeply. Just a couple of words about balance, and as I move towards the concept of anxiety and pleasure. Throughout our life experiences, we are so often thrown off balance. It's one of our realities. And our efforts to adapt, to adjust, and strive for balances, I would say, is a big defining feature of our lives. It's not the imbalance. It's our quest, our adaptation, our adjustment to that imbalance that is a big defining feature of our lives. And that this whole issue of balance and imbalance has been highlighted during this pandemic. We've been thrown off balance. I mean, we've had to adapt, we've had to adjust, we've had to reach deeply into ourselves to find new ways and tools that help us adjust and find balance. And we've needed to do this in a super dynamic environment. I mean, you think about every day you pick up the paper, there's something new, vaccines, no vaccines. Oh my God, there's blood clots in Europe. Well, why are there not blood clots elsewhere? You know, and it's just this flow, and it's coming at us from all directions, often in a disconnected way. The information comes at us, and that this disconnection between different pieces of information, it elevates our sense of uncertainty, and it in many ways it forces us ourselves to connect the dots, because they're not being connected for us out there. There's just information, and to connect the dots in order to make sense of that information so that we can create our own knowledge from that information and gain clarity. This isn't easy with this daily river of information flow that we're trying to stand in, but it's important to recognize that it's not easy. You know, in yoga, we often talk about, or I hear words around oscillation and balance, and they're concepts that are embedded in yoga. And this notion of balance implies equilibrium, finding the sweet spot, keeping what are often opposing forces in check is, of course, key. These things are key. And so what are the forces that we are balancing during this pandemic? What is the yin and yang, if you will, of this pandemic? Well, of course, there's all sorts of forces. We're trying to manage personal forces within our personal lives, within our family lives, within our social networks and lives, within our work lives, etc. But when I think kind of more broadly about COVID and this pandemic, two opposing forces that come to mind and I feel require balance are anxiety and pleasure, well-being. And why do I say this? Well, I say this because throughout this pandemic, we see, on the one hand, anxiety that is triggered by the discomfort and uncertainty surrounding so many elements of this pandemic that throws us off balance. And at the same time, pleasure and reward triggered by hope and discovery as we explore and out of the uncertainty actually discover unexpected positive elements of our new ways of being. I mean, we've all bumped into people and you've heard people say, you know, I didn't expect that. You know, at the beginning, I wasn't sure, but now I'm discovering certain elements of this is not so bad, right? And so we're finding ways of discovery of pleasure, as well as the discovery of, or as well as the experience of anxiety on the other side. And you know, I see a number of people that I've crossed paths with and worked with, and you know, there's certain Francoisms that I often share, and sometimes ad nauseum because I repeat them a lot. And one of them is I've often been heard to refer to these two forces as opposite sides, as two sides of the same coin. The upside of uncertainty, which is hope, exploration, and discovery, and pleasure and reward, and the downside of uncertainty, fear and immobility, anxiety. And in some ways, I think that we operate, our lives during this pandemic are operating between those two goalposts. You know, on the one hand, anxiety, and on the other hand, you know, hope and exploration. Most psychologists will probably tell you that anxiety and pleasure do not mix well. I would go so far as to say that they don't mix at all. Indeed, it is difficult when you have true anxiety to feel pleasure, and it's difficult to feel anxiety when you have true pleasure. And clinicians that deal with more extreme forms, clinical forms of these dimensions, will often say that in many ways anxiety and pleasure are opposites. They really don't go together. When one is up, the other is down. And anxiety in many ways causes mental space to contract. You know, if you think about fear, the mental space contract. You think about a bear running towards you. You know, you don't have the luxury of looking sideways and opening up your mental. It's a narrow space. Whilst pleasure causes mental space to open up. And so that's I think a concept that's important to keep in mind with respect to the relationship between space and these opposing forces. All this is a yin and yang of sorts, as I mentioned. It's interesting for me, and perhaps one of the most fascinating elements of the brain's organization when it comes to emotion is the fact that there are identifiable, discrete brain circuits and centers that underlie our capacity to feel pleasure. And there are a different set of brain circuits and centers that underlie our capacity to feel fear and anxiety. They are there. The depth, when we talk about pleasure and well-being or fear, the depth of these emotions are actually captured by the brain. And if ever you have a chance to read the story of how the pleasure centers of the brain were discovered, you should do that. Olds and Milner, Peter Milner and James Olds and Milner in 1954 published that paper in the journal Science. And it was the first time that centers of the brain devoted to the experience of pleasure and positive affect had been identified. And it was a very, very exciting discovery. And by the way, it was discovered through serendipity. They weren't looking for this at all. They had no hypothesis, but what they did have was an open mind. Because what happened during the experiment is something very unusual, and I can't get into the details because we don't have the time, but something unusual happened. And because they had an open mind, rather than brushing off that one-off or that outlier, they actually decided to pay attention to it. And that outlier turned out to completely open up a new world of research and science. Peter Milner, who I worked with when I was a student at McGill University, we used to call him Dr. Pleasure, but actually he was, if you ever met him, he was actually a very serene, calm, thoughtful, slow-talking individual. So whatever images you might get of Dr. Pleasure, that's not. It was something. The image was the way I just described. So, and at around the same time, and over the next 20 years, the fear-based systems in the brain were also characterized and developed. So. That's fascinating in itself, that something as deep as pleasure and as profound as pleasure and positive can actually have can be captured by a physical substrate in the brain. For me, is quite amazing, and actually got me hooked in science. Just that concept that the depth of our emotional experiences can actually be captured by our biology, and what nature has given us, these tools to help us navigate through these emotions, to me, was quite phenomenal. What is also fascinating to me is that the brain systems that control anxiety and fear are oppositionally linked to the brain systems that connect with pleasure and reward. In other words, the two are counter each other. So just as we say as psychologists that the two can't go together, it is also true that the brain actually has designed itself. Nature has created this oppositional relationship between the two. Like I said, when one is up, the other is down. So in some ways, a lot of this is intuitive and represents an emotional axis that of opposing forces. And I will also say this, I do sometimes feel that we're living in a period where there is a bias towards seeking pleasure and actually a bit of an avoidance of discomfort. You know, there were books written, this concept I think started emerging in the 90s. There's a book called The Prozac Generation, you know, that basically was making the point that perhaps Prozac, which is an antidepressant, was being overprescribed, and maybe the bar was too low, you know, in some cases for these. But the general concept being that I do wonder sometimes if we are in a period where avoiding discomfort is kind of paramount to some extent. At this point, you know, many people, for example, would be thinking, well, okay, now that I understand anxiety is about fear and closing of the spaces, mental space, and pleasure is about opening mental space, then we need to get rid of anxiety or avoid anxiety and go for the pleasure. But it's complicated, and it's more complicated than that. And for true clarity, we need to understand that we actually need both. But we need to understand when or why we need, and when or why we don't need. Sometimes we need anxiety. And by the way, it's very important, I want to make this point. I am not talking about clinical anxiety disorders here. I'm using the word anxiety in a descriptive way. I'm talking about our normal fears, the reasonable and expected angst that we can feel in particular situations. And it's important to distinguish that the two, and not to confuse clinical debilitating anxiety disorders with emotions of fear and great caution that are part of everyday life. Sometimes it's good to be afraid. Sometimes we need to stop before taking another step. It's for our own safety, our own preservation. We are guided by fear sometimes. It's what I've always called the downside of uncertain, fear of the unknown. And by the way, that's probably the oldest emotion in humans and living things. And it's a good thing to have sometimes. And sometimes we need pleasure and positive affect. And again, I use this term descriptively and not in a clinical sense, because there are disorders of our pleasures and reward systems like addiction and other related disorders. So I'm talking about, again, the pleasures and rewards that are part of normal and everyday life. Sometimes we need to approach things that we believe will feel good, that we believe will bring us energy and bring us goodness. And in these cases, we're not afraid. We're guided by courage, and we're guided by inspiration as we face the unknown. And you can think about this in so many situations, whether we're talking about relationships or our lives. There are points where you're drawn. There's a push and pull between, you know, fear of the unknown and moving forward. It's important to keep all this in mind, that balance, because it's also part of, for example, resilience. You know, understanding resilience and how we can be stronger as individuals. And part of that is experiencing those tensions, experiencing the push and pull, so that you can more deeply understand those two states and find a path that is most, I guess, optimal, if you will. The balance between what brings us pleasure and what brings us angst is something we need to understand and be aware of. And our brains, again, have given us the biological tools to experience and deal with both. And so, you know, when I think about resilience and well-being and how do we get through these tensions, we do have to. It's really, I think it's very helpful to remember we have tools. Nature has given us tools to deal with some of the downside of uncertainty as well as the upside. There are a number of elements to understanding that balance between anxiety and reward systems in the brain. So in terms of understanding, some of the things we need to think about is understanding, first of all, the contradictory nature of these forces, and understanding the inherent tension between the two, and understanding, and this speaks a little bit to resilience, that it's okay and it's expected to feel the tensions and to feel the push and pull of uncertainty. I'll give you a concrete example. Cosmina, my wife, and I have been discussing the question of the AstraZeneca vaccine. The truth is we're getting contradictory messages, right? On the one hand, everybody's saying there's no evidence, but on the other hand, countries have shut down the vaccine. Oops, that's not, sorry about that. I meant to turn that off. It's not about the vaccine situation with AstraZeneca, so we began to talk about because we're getting contradictory information. And so we've kind of worked through we've worked through a lot of that. We've talked about it, and we've accepted the angst that, quite frankly, a lot of this information has created, and working through it. And it's a moving target. It changes, and it's okay to feel that tension. It's easy, for example, to say, "Oh, come on, you're a scientist, and the data doesn't support it." Well, that's true, but in addition to being a scientist, I'm a human being, and I'm not immune from feeling some fear when I hear that 6 countries have shut down. So I would love to know, what is deeply behind that. So it's normal to feel the tension and to experience it. And part of that journey of coming to a decision is actually going through that tension, just experiencing it and land somewhere. And we are very, very soon going to land on a position with respect to the AstraZeneca, which is really to take the vaccine, quite frankly, and do that relatively soon, because we're in that age group. The other point that I wanted to make is that understanding that exploration and openness of our reward pleasure system is also key to preparedness, and that's something else that I hope is something that we can we can also think about, and that is that sometimes these things happen in series. So if you give yourself the space, but so I make the point about preparedness, and again, understanding that these two states and the need for balance between is important for the reasons we've discussed. I want to just share some final thoughts, and then we should go to questions. Understanding the quest for equilibrium is not the same as having equilibrium itself. We strive for balance. We strive to keep things in check, but it's fluid. It's just as the world around us is constantly changing, the world inside us is constantly changing. Indeed, many of us, when we think of the brain, although we think of a static organ, I mean, most of us, if you think of an image of brain, you see this still image. It's a photograph of, one side, the right side or the left side of the brain. But the brain is anything but static. It is it is nonstop activity, and it's constantly changing. Your brains before and after this seminar are going to be different. It's just, and they'll be different in the next hour. It's constantly changing. In many ways, the brain's a chemical factory, which is never static. It's constantly changing. If you think about, left brain, right brain, they're balancing, they're talking to each other. If you think about at the level of the synapse, there's constant adjustment. If there's too much chemical messenger being released, there's a compensatory response. It's constantly adjusting, but actually, it's never static. We never actually truly reach equilibrium. It's a nonstop oscillation. And in many ways, that's reflective of our lives. The notion of reaching some kind of resting state or steady state is a bit of an illusion. We are constantly adjusting. And what I would imagine, and what I guess we strive for, is reducing the oscillation so that the swings, you know, are not so we're closer to that ideal. And that's what the brain does. I mean, the brain, it works exactly in that way. So equilibrium of the brain is really a journey rather than a destination. It's an ongoing effort to keep activity within a reasonable range, within a healthy range. Like I said, a bit like a pendulum. And the very last thought and comment on the relationship between brain and the human experience. I find it, and I said this at the beginning, I find it fascinating how the human brain has evolved to capture the richness and the depth of the human experience. To understand that something as rich as fear and hope are captured by systems in our bodies, for me, is truly fascinating. It's a reminder of the profound dynamicity of the brain and the human experience. There is, as I said, nothing static about the brain, and there's nothing static about the human experience. It's constantly changing, adapting, evolving. And we should all feel very, very good in the knowledge that our bodies are designed to support our efforts to find balance in our minds. And on that note, I will say thank you. And it probably ran over a little bit, but happy to pass it over to Lalit at this point. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Franco. That was amazing, amazing. I'll just share a couple of comments, and then I'll open the stage for the questions. So lots of beautiful comments, and one of them from Shiv. Thank you, Dr. Vaccarino, for an enlightening experience. Just great. And then Daniel Siphon, that was very interesting to me too. Really enjoying this talk and wonderful reflections and concepts, but was hoping Dr. Vaccarino would also lead some yoga exercises. So we can get ready for Dr. Vaccarino's yoga class, So we will open the stage and take the questions. So please feel your question, what you have. I see one in the chat here, so I will ask Dr. Franco about that. I very much like the idea of respect-based approach. Unfortunately, it seems that we are losing that value nowadays. You are either with us or against us. We seem to be losing the proper balance and an honest, civil, respectful debate among different people with different opinions. So what is your take on that, Dr. Franco?
Well, I would say that is an observation, and it's I think it's a fair observation. I think that there is truth that I do wonder sometimes if things have truly changed, or if just the amount, the volume of the oppositional voices and the us and them has become so, the amplitude is so high that it is just so much more apparent. But regardless, the first image that comes to mind when I have conversations about exactly this point is a bridge. I think it is true, but I think we all have to decide in our lives: are we bridge builders? Do we believe in our common humanity? Do we fundamentally believe in our sense of common purpose? And if the answer is yes to that, then you might be able to find space and hope, even for those situations where you're connecting with someone who is being perhaps very disrespectful and has a very different view or opposite view, and that being on one team or the other. These are incremental changes. I mean, one of the things that I would think about a lot in those situations is, what is that person's story? The indigenous community, and I've heard in that community often they say that we are our stories, and people who have views that are diametrically opposed to one's own views, and express them in a less than civil way, they have their stories. And it's easy to get drawn into what I call the black hole, you know, they get pulled into that darkness. But they have their stories, they have their reasons. And I guess the last point I'll make on that one is, you know, it's interesting to me when I think about some of the polarization, you know, political polarization, right and the left. And I think about, you know, liberal values, for example, and when I think about values, I think about values that are not so much liberal or conservative, but they should be our common humanity. And those are values like compassion and caring. And so when we are confronted with someone who is, let's just say, is very aversive, is having a very negative impact on, it's easy to feel sorry and to feel compassion for someone who is, let's say, underprivileged or has not had the opportunities and has been in a bad, you know, is growing up in a bad part of the world. It's easy to feel sorry for that person, but it's not so easy to feel sorry for someone who might be equally marginalized, who might feel equally alienated, but on the surface has all of the things that that don't match who we would reach out for compassion. And so I guess I would say that we should think a little bit deeply about what does compassion mean, and is compassion conditional, you know, and it, like I said, it's a slow process. It's not easy to do that. Trust me. I mean, I don't disagree with that, but you do have to believe, you know, you have to decide, you know, in terms of your values, is that something that you believe in? Are you going to work on that bridge, even if it's 1 foot at a time, and eventually, hopefully, create that sense of common purpose and common humanity.
Thank you very much, Franco. Just, you know, we are a little bit over time. I don't know if Dr. Franco has some time. If you have some time, we can continue this. Otherwise,
I'm okay to take. It's up to you, Lalit. I've booked off some time here, so I'm okay. Whatever you would like.
I think that's great. I think it's a great talk here, and we are learning so much from you. I mean, you know, I say that yoga actually starts when you leave the yoga room. You know, what do you do, or what we do, whoever the yogis are, in the remaining 23 hours, you know. And that's how I see you, Dr. Franco, that you are doing the yoga for those 23 hours, you know. That's beautiful. So anyway, I think somebody has raised a hand. It's Shiv. Shiv, you want to go ahead?
Dr. Vaccarino, first of all, I want to thank you very much for a very enlightening lecture. I learned a lot, and I was interested in your statement about knowledge creation. I understand yoga, the main purpose for me is knowledge creation and understanding, expansion of the understanding, knowledge authentication, enabling executive function, those kind of things. And I had a problem that I needed to solve. And I think yoga is a system. You can throw any problem at it, and it will lead you to its resolution. So it is a system which is very useful in academia, because I've been an academic in my life, and the problem that I had, I wanted to solve it in an academic manner, so that I do not bring in any belief systems and things like that. So I took refuge in yoga, and the problem that I wanted to solve was the problem of interfaith harmony in the world. There's a lot of conflict in the world resulting from non-acceptance of the other being defined as defined by faith, or it could also be defined by race, color, skin, creed, nationality, whatever. So I wanted to come up with um, an education that needed to expand your mind to see our common humanity. And I took refuge in yoga, and I take pleasure in saying that I wrote a book in 2020, and which got awarded by Books for Peace International organization out of Rome. And I had never known about that organization. I still don't know about that organization because I don't know Italian. And most of the websites there is in Italian. And they somehow got a hold of a copy of my book, and they awarded a Peace Award to this book, citing that this is a masterpiece unifying spirituality and science. And that is the gift of yoga to me, yogic contemplation. I took refuge there. I would get up in the morning, any time of whenever I wanted to do some work, could not sleep, whether it's 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. And the first thing I did was I sat in what in Sanskrit called dhyana, means contemplation. And I would contemplate my way through, and the yoga would show me the way. It was not thinking that I was doing. It was just attention that I was paying to the problem, and the problem was showing me the solution itself. And that's the beauty of yoga. You do not need to be a PhD in anything, because I had no concept of spirituality. I had no concept of neuroscience. And I presented the principles of yoga, and Lalit attended that presentation in neurophysiological terms. So I had never taken a course in neurology, never taken a course on physiology. We are physically made in ways that we do not normally pay attention to. And once we understand ourselves, and that is what yoga leads you to an understanding of your own self and your own potential, which is unlimited, and it opens the door for you. And that's my experience with yoga. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for those comments. And I'm certainly from a technical level, I'm not a yoga expert, but in my conversations with Lalit and you know, it was quite heartening to see the alignment between us in terms of the thoughts, and Lalit's been very kind in terms of, you know, emphasizing how some of the ideas that I was sharing today actually fit well with the yoga process. And I will say that I'm actually looking forward to learning more about the you know, the kind of the specifics you know, of the process. So thank you for those comments, Shiv.
Okay, so if it's okay, maybe we can take one more question at least. It says that why are some people experience anxiety and depression? I would like to hear what you, an expert in the field, say about this. Thanks for caring.
Yeah, it's it's a wonderful and an important question, very important. So first of all, at the outset, as I was saying, you know, we use these terms, depression and anxiety, we use them in different ways. We sometimes use them descriptively, which is the way I've used them today. But the question, I think, is really around the clinical conditions of depression, anxiety. And really the difference between when we talk about anxiety, depression, descriptively versus clinically, is really around dysfunctionality. When your fear or your energy levels and your view of the world are so dark that actually it prevents you from carrying out what would otherwise be normal functions, that's when it goes into the clinical category. To be more pointed and direct on the question, anxiety and depression very often go together. Not always, but very often. A significant proportion of people who experience clinical depression will also experience clinical anxiety, and in the other direction as well. And there are multiple reasons for this, but I'll try to just point out a few key points. First of all, if you think about it from a motivational standpoint, depression is a disorder of motivation to some extent. It's not just that; it's more than that. You know, depression is also characterized by abnormalities in eating patterns, sleep difficulties, those kinds of things. But there's also a motivational component, and that motivational component is characterized by a lack of initiative, an inability to conjure up the energy to pursue a goal, to experience pleasure and happiness when you are pursuing that goal and going towards. So that characterizes kind of a clinical depression from a motivation standpoint. Anxiety actually has an overlap with that. If you think about anxiety from a goal-seeking perspective, in anxiety, there is fear of failure. There's fear of the unknown, and we all experience fear of the unknown. But in an anxiety disorder, it's an unreasonable fear of the unknown. And so when people pursue goals, their primary mindset is that they're going to fail, that they're not going to reach that goal. And so so often anxiety in terms of goal setting and goal reaching go hand in hand with depression, which is also associated with a holding back of reward, a holding back of the pleasure of approach and seeking. So it's different facets, I would say, to the goal-seeking behavior. That is one element in my mind that connects anxiety and depression at a motivational level. But they're also distinguishable at another level.
Any other question? One last question.
I have a very quick question.
Sure.
Franco, thank you so much. That was a humbling talk. I'm interested in anxiety as well, and on the paths. You talked about that occurring in a different part of the brain than the pleasure. I'm interested in the paths of that anxiety as someone who suffered partial complex seizures for a long time, but eventually became convulsive seizures. And then I'm no longer having them, and that's partly a result, I think, of anticonvulsants. For 2 years only I was on, partly as for hypnotherapy. I cannot disqualify that. But from what I understood, the paths of a seizure make it more possible that a seizure can come as you have more and more and more. It gets more likely that you'll be able to. Is that the same with anxiety? Is that the paths of an anxiety response in your brain would make you more likely? And in which case you'd have to go back and go back and back and back and go in depth.
Yeah, great question, Sheila. You cut out for a short time, but I think I caught the question. I always love it when people say, "Oh, this is a quick question." The question's quick. The answer is, but I don't think you were asking, is there a relationship between seizures and anxiety? No. I think what you were asking is, just as in the case of seizures where there's what's called a sensitization. In other words, it's the opposite of desensitization. It's where you have one seizure and it builds. It actually builds on it. Is there a similar process in anxiety disorders? And the answer is actually there can be. And there is is evidence for sensitization of these systems, so that perhaps because of the particular circumstances that are biased towards, let's say, failure of achieving a goal, that feeds into the fear of not achieving, and that unfortunate coincidence a few times in a row now then becomes a concept, and it grows. There's a sensitization. It's interesting that if you look at the brain, there are actually neurological parallels to this. Where at the beginning of a process, there's a sensitization. At the end of the process, there's a desensitization. You can actually desensitize, almost flood the system so that it goes in the opposite direction. But similarly, like with the pleasure centers and the reward systems, and this has been shown in addiction. So for example, there's a sensitization that happens in the addiction process, where at the very, very beginning, often during the exploratory phases of drug taking, there's actually a sensitization, so that the second, third, and fourth time that drug, it actually feels better and better and better. And then, of course, if it goes badly, then you end up in an addicted state. And then there's the opposite in the longer term, which is desensitization. And so there are these systems. They exist neurologically and they exist psychologically as well. And it's an excellent point that you make, because it's actually during the process of sensitization, or think of it as, during the process of developing the disorder, that's actually the opportunity to reflect and open up your mental space to be able to see that coming, if you will. Because once the disorder is in full bloom, it's actually difficult to create the mental space for that, and that's where you need support and treatments and that. But again, it's all very individual. I didn't want to get too much into the clinical side of things, but those are just some thoughts to share. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
I think it's almost time now. So I think we will finish this event now. And I thank you, all of you. I thank you, Dr. Franco Vaccarino, and also audience, all of you. Without you, it will not be possible. So if you still have any questions now, on the beginning of the chat, there are links, where you can go and write your feedback. So we will receive that feedback, and then we can take it back to the speaker. And we are also planning to open a blog there, so hopefully maybe we can continue these discussions there as well.
Wow.
Thank you very much. So let's join our palms together.
Could I just, Lalit, if I could just say one final word.
Sure.
I want to say thank you to all of you. I can't tell you how happy it is for me to be part of this, and to see you all either in name or in picture or photo or video. So thank you for the time, and I really appreciate also your good words on the chat list. I'm not going to get a chance to reply to everyone who said such nice things, and but I do want to say thank you now to all of you for that, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you on campus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lalitji.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mani.